Good evening all, and welcome. Are imaginary friends all in our heads? Or can they be a bit more real than you give them credit for? Tonight, we're gonna find out. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My friend is Native American and was supposed to be the shaman for his tribe until he converted to Christianity. He said before he converted, things happened to him that he could not explain. When he was 4, he was a very mild-mannered kid who never spoke to anyone. He was held back in pre-K for being too antisocial. He was the type of kid who'd construct little highways for his Hot Wheels and make them wait at red lights instead of running around and making them fly and explode. He always kept to himself, and his parents never tried to force him to socialize. One day, his great-grandmother came to visit. He's never met her before. He was in the backyard playing, and heard the door open and close. He walked into the house, walked straight up to his great-grandmother, placed his hand on her knee, and with great compassion he said, "Don't worry, it's going to be okay." She passed away that night. Freaked his parents out so badly. When he was a little older, he would go next door to play, and would hang out with the kid and his family, eat dinner there, and play fun games. It was his first real friend. They played together for years. The parents thought it was cute he had an imaginary friend. My friend was upset. "He's not imaginary. I've been to his house, I've met his family, I've seen the inside and I've eaten his food. He's as real as you and I. I can see him, touch to him, talk to him, and he talks back." They moved away maybe a year after the conversation. When my friend turned 15, someone mentioned his imaginary friend, and he got angry again. He looked up newspaper articles to prove their existence, and found an article about a house next door to him that burnt down 14 years prior to them moving in. It was a family of 3 that was stuck inside. Their photos were printed. It was them. He cried. He says since he converted, these things don't happen often. His tribe is terribly pissed because he was incredibly gifted in this. He said he can still kind of sense when people die, but it's very weak. I'm an atheist, raised in an agnostic household, and in no way consider myself especially sensitive to anything of a paranormal sort. I consider myself a skeptic, so there are experiences I share here, and only those I couldn't explain away on my own. Since my childhood home was a unique one, I'll share some details. Around 40 years ago, my parents purchased a Northern California ranch from a family who held the land since the original white settlers of the area. The home itself was a converted schoolhouse, moved and rebuilt board by board to its final resting place. It is constructed from crates collected from the San Francisco Bay. The boards still ramped with dates over 2 centuries ago. The walls are canvases with aged maps of the world, presumably from when the schoolhouse was active, plastered and painted over. Really quite fascinating and a little spooky. I'll start with what I call the man in the orange hat. This one's probably the easiest to explain away, since I was so young at the time, still crib-bound. I had my own small room in a corner of the house, which I shared with a doorless, long, narrow walk-in closet. The closet was always dark, the doorway looming to little me. I wasn't scared of the closet though, because I had a friend in there, a tall, grizzled old gentleman wearing a grey work shirt, matching slacks, and an orange feed cap. Every day after my midday nap, and before my mother came to take me from my crib, the man in the orange hat would come out from within my closet and we'd talk, sometimes for what felt like hours to little me. He always left before my mother came in, and eventually stopped coming altogether. My mum would hear me talking within my closed bedroom, and assumed I was chattering with myself as toddlers do. I would tell my parents what I remembered from each of my varied conversations with the man, which they wrote off as a vivid imagination and an imaginary friend. Today, I don't remember my conversations with the man in the orange hat, and my memory of his appearance has faded to the basics of his clothing. But his memory has stuck with me for 30 years. I'm not sure an imaginary friend would have left such a lasting impression. As a footnote, many years later, my parents recalled to me that the elder of the original homeowner's family had died in that very room. In fact, his passing was the deciding factor in the sale of the home and land. None of us have any idea what the elderly gentleman looked like, but grey clothes and an orange cap is a pretty tempting conclusion to draw. My wife and I bought a condo and moved into it a few months before she gave birth to our first child. I never got any bad feelings in the place for that time. After he was born, my wife insisted on co-sleeping with him. The baby sleeps in your bed. Once we started putting him in his crib, he was probably 8 months old at this point. He started having night terrors. He would wake up screaming. We assumed it was the transition to sleeping alone. There were times, however, when I would pick him up and he would continue to scream and would fight me to turn himself so he was facing the closet door. He would continue to scream and repeatedly point at the door, and he wouldn't calm down until I would carry him out the room. This happened every now and again for the next few months. It was creepy, but it was pretty infrequent. Eventually, it freaked my wife out enough, and she felt the need to nail up this old cross she had inside the closet. Once he was old enough to sleep in the toddler bed, it pretty much stopped. Or, if he woke up, he would just get up and come to us. Fast forward, he's now 4. My son doesn't ever make things up. He's never had an imaginary friend, and if he tells me a story about something, it's always a slightly skewed version of real events. Christmas morning, we're getting ready to go to Grandma's house, and I'm getting him dressed, and he starts telling me a story about his new friend. I have a new friend. Oh, what's their name? I don't know. I'll just call him Max. Okay, so what do you guys do? We were just sleeping in the bed, but then there was this loud noise. Someone wanted to get into the bedroom really bad because the door was locked and they kept crashing into it really hard. Wow, so your friend Max was in the bedroom last night? Yep, we stayed really close when that person was trying to crash through the door and kept our eyes shut real tight. But then Max got really brave and took me to the door to unlock it and let me get to my mummy. Now, that night, the bedroom door was shut all the way, which is not normal, but it was cold and only in that room, so we put the heater on, and we never locked doors aside from our front door. That story and how unconcerned he was with the events he described was what really freaked us out. After he told me that, a bunch of memories of things he said in the past came to me. Mostly he would tell me about a guy without a face and fire on his head. But at the time I wrote it off to being the life-size anatomy poster my wife hung in the bedroom. Now, my wife is so freaked out by this, she wants me to burn sage in the house. Kinda hard to find whole sage in Chicago in January. Any possible suggestions for cleansing would be most welcome. My little brothers both had the same imaginary friend 10 years apart. When my brother Dominic was 5 or 6, he would spend hours in his room talking to 2 imaginary friends named Alma and Waka. He pronounced it Wakea. He spoke to them most days for about 6 months. One day, my mum found him in his room crying. She asked what was wrong. He said, "Alma and Wakea don't want to play with me anymore. They went up there," pointing to the attic in his room. About 10 years later, my youngest brother Charlie, who has autism, came downstairs from bed around midnight. He was crying but not making any noise. He came and just sat on the sofa, and my mum asked him what was wrong. "Wakea's dead. He's got blood in his head." He didn't know anything about Dominic's imaginary friends. We never spoke about it. With him having autism, he never lies, which makes it that bit creepier. We've had more experiences in our house, which was owned by a priest before us. I've been searching all day for what the names could mean. Alma is a Spanish word meaning soul, and waker means he who wakes. If anyone knows anything about this, it would be greatly appreciated. I've also been talking to my brother, and he made a really good point. My mum went through a phase of playing with a homemade Ouija board. I thought it was just nonsense, but to be honest, everyone in our house is spiraling down. My mum drinks a lot, I do too, my mother is depressed, and so is my dad. Perhaps it's all connected. I'm a believer in the paranormal, but keep my mind open to the science of it. Who knows what it could be? I'm 23, and I'm a descendant of the Whaley House in San Diego, California, and my entire family, to my knowledge, has had multiple encounters with a being that either followed our family one person at a time, or each of us is just more in tune with the supernatural, and we've all gotten our own personal hauntings. Now, growing up with my parents, things would disappear in the home and reappear in the least used rooms of the house, and would almost always appear to be hidden there. Sometimes objects would be exactly where they weren't 10 minutes later in plain sight. The same room you were in. There'd be noises in the attic room above on the 2nd floor, and there'd be random sounds, hearing my name called from somewhere in the house where no one was, peeking out of my room and asking if my parents had called me, and getting a no as a response was a normal daily thing. We all had our own interactions with this being in our home, and it was always a mild annoyance at most, with some slight fear, because obviously, what can you do about a stapler reappearing on your desk after you needed it 10 minutes ago and it wasn't there? What can you do when the remote ends up on the bed in the upstairs guest room, where no one goes? My dad has a video of an I Love Lucy lunchbox walking forward on a shelf, teetering on the edges as if someone had gently pushed it, thinking that's enough to make it fall. It wasn't enough to fall, and so the being slammed it to the ground instead, in the middle of the day, while my dad was home sick, alone, and right in front of him. This story is to show that these beings don't care if we know they're there or not. He would also game in our kitchen or the PC that we had, and he played WoW until around midnight to 2 or 3 in the morning sometimes. He'd have our dog's toys thrown at him occasionally, with much more force than a dog could muster. Not really thrown, so much as tossed at him, I guess. I saw one such time coming into the kitchen grabbing a snack, and it really messed with us, but we joked it off. If it wanted to hurt us, it probably would have by now. Perhaps pushed someone down the stairs, dropped a toaster in the bath, whatever, but it never harmed us, not even scratches. This is the part of the story where I must describe to you the entity Jimmy. According to my grandparents, the Whaley side grandparents, they would hear me talking to a boy from the backyard without hearing the other boy's voice. They would look out the window and see me swinging on a swing, like I was being pushed by something more human than wind. They didn't interfere with it, because what can they do about it but scare their grandchild and ruin their imagination? And even past that, what can you do to combat a being you have no knowledge on, that you can't see? My parents also heard conversations between Jimmy and I. They all sounded like normal, harmless conversations to myself, but I would answer back to a question that had been asked that I may not have been smart enough to think of by myself, answering questions of a higher caliber than any 4-year-old could muster. I don't remember any of the conversations, and as I've grown older, he interacted with me less and less. I honestly didn't even know about any of the interactions I'd had with an imaginary friend named Jimmy until my grandparents brought it up with me while I was visiting them, and they prefaced it by saying, "We think you're old enough to know now, but your imaginary childhood friend was real and he wasn't human. We would hear you talking to someone, full-on conversations, and we'd sometimes hear a voice that wasn't yours, but it never seemed outright dangerous or malicious." Stuff like that. It's important to note that none of these conversations were directly around other people. Everyone would at least be one room away, or a good bit off from me when Jimmy would come around. After hearing the information about Jimmy, I started to get bits and pieces of memories back together, kind of fragmented from a childhood view, which is how they're remembered. It's hard to make sense of, but I definitely felt like something was always there, and always has been. It's kind of reinforced that feeling hearing this from my grandparents. Now, I knew that I was haunted before receiving this information from my family, but hearing the name Jimmy in that kind of context brought me a feeling with the name, like familiarity, sort of curiosity. I knew he'd not hurt me though, probably. Now for my personal stories and encounters, both prior to and post hearing about Jimmy. I'd be playing World of Warcraft by myself at home while my family was out, and I'd turn around sometimes and see a tall dark mass with red, smoke-filled eyes watching me from across the room, and he would always disappear the moment I noticed him. This didn't happen often, but I always got a chill in the back of my neck, the kind that crawls down your spine, that feeling when you get some unnatural stuff happening around you. I would see it outside of my home sometimes, like it was following me in particular. I'd be in school and feel a solid tug on my back to pull me backwards, and get the familiar chills, turn around only to find an empty hallway, then continue on my way to class. That was as far as things went for a while. There'd be noises throughout the house here and there where nobody was more so than I just home alone. Sometimes with my parents or friends over. Living with it, you adjust to it, get tired of it, and it'll start to frustrate you. You'd yell at it to shut up because it's 3 a.m. on a school night and you need sleep, or were you trying to relax? Fear turns to exasperation. One night, the exasperation turned back to fear rather quickly though. I was falling asleep and heard a series of knocks in the house as I was quickly dozing off. All I remember from the dream I had that night is that I got out of bed, heard voices calling me to our game room from the deepest corner of the house, furthest away from where anyone could hear anything. I was drawn to the corner by some kind of force, and having no fear of the paranormal anymore, only anger and exasperation at the minor annoyance I'd been forced to live through in my life, I walked to it confidently. It was darker than the rest of the room by a lot, and the closer I got to the corner, the worse I felt. Dread overtook my body, and as I got pulled into the corner by a seeming horde of demons, I cried out for help. I had no voice to call with though, and the words caught in my throat, and no matter how much I forced them out, no sound came, not even gurgles or chokes, just silence. I don't know how long the dream lasted, being swallowed by darkness and demons, unable to scream, powerless and overcome by dread. But it stayed with me upon waking. That dream was 7 years ago, and I can still remember every detail of it. I still get that dream, that nightmare to this day, and I honestly don't have the words to describe the horror that these dreams bring me. Feeling so powerless against something, I don't know if it was a dream or astral projection or whatever. I just wish it would stop. I've moved several times since then, and paranormal presences have followed me, or I've found them everywhere. I lived in Denton with the famous Goatman's Bridge and spent multiple nights out there, trying to find something and just enjoying being outside and alone. Being an only child and an outdoorsy person, I love being alone and outdoors. It's peaceful. Most nights out there I'd see nothing, but I always got that tingling feeling on the back of my neck that something was looking at me. When I would try to take people out with me, they would be all for it until we got a little ways in. Then they would get the same feeling I did and wanted to get out as quickly as possible. And I can't say I blamed them. It was always a stronger neck tingle with people over there. I don't know what was in the woods, but it followed my every move while I was out there, and I never once felt truly alone. But I settled for mostly alone because it left me alone, and I wanted to fish in peace. Some nights I would see a really tall, misshapen figure dart between trees or hide behind trees across the riverbank. Whatever. It just wanted to watch, I was sure. I even participated in some pagan rituals out there, and on the last one I participated in, a monarch butterfly flew over and landed on my finger. Then as soon as the fire was lit, it started to dart among the flames, like it didn't want them there, like it was warning us to go. So my friend and I put the fire out, and no sooner had we done that, I felt arguably the largest neck tingle I'd ever felt. We got the hell out of those woods, and the butterfly followed us. It refused to leave us, and even got into the car with us. I dropped my friend off at her place, and she took the butterfly with her to care for it, and give it some food, and checking it for fire damage. So I drove home, and had my neck tingling the whole way. Everything seemed slightly off to me. The way my car was driving, the roads, the other drivers, even the walk to the apartment was weird. I don't really have a word for it, but it was like everything familiar to me was a little different somehow. I got inside, locked the doors, closed the windows as tight as I could, drew the blinds, and as I was lowering the blinds I saw a tall, dark figure with red, misty eyes looking up to my third-floor apartment from ground level across the way. The same kind of figure I'd seen while playing WoW in my room whilst growing up. There was another time my friends and I were going through a cemetery to get to their apartment faster. There were 4 of us in total, my friends and myself. We were scouting out the cemetery for the exit gate on the other side. We couldn't find one, so we walked back to where the entrance should have been and couldn't find it. I'm not saying it wasn't there, I'm just saying we couldn't locate it. We were in college and it was pretty late. We were a little drunk, but not completely out of it by any means. The point is, as far as I knew, we were just fenced in. This freaked us out, so we started walking towards the far fence to their apartment, and we were just going to hop it, when my first friend says, "Hey, do you think we could look into that building?" It was a mausoleum type building, and we told him we shouldn't, and we just wanted to get out of there. Well, he went to check it out anyway, and as he rounded the corner I got a great idea. I'd scare him by creeping around. I told my other friends my plan, and they hopped in on it. I crept around the same corner he did, made sure he rounded the other corner of the building, then crept up some more, peeked around and didn't see him, so I went around the corner again. Just then I heard movement behind me. I assumed it was him and laughed out loud. "Ha, you got me, man." As I turned, I saw him peek his head out around the corner and disappear again rather quickly. I then looked over at my friends around the corner. I was on the back of the building away from my friends about 10 yards away, and saw all 3 of them slowly walking off, knowing I'd catch up with them and laugh about my failed prank. But then who was that around the corner? I looked around the whole building and didn't see anyone, So I jogged over to my friends and told them that we really needed to get out of there. My friends know me, and I'm a pretty comedic guy. I joke around a lot. But they could see how serious I was, and we beelined it to the fence and hopped it as fast as we could. I told them what happened when we got inside, and friend Mod said the reason he noped away from the building so fast was because he got scared and he felt like he was being watched, and now was glad he did. I can only assume that it was Jimmy. That all of this might have been Jimmy. I have so many questions and so few answers. Is it really Jimmy? What is he? Why me? Why is he still here? Why did the butterfly cut off the ritual? It wasn't even a ritual for summon anything, it was just a ritual for the moon on the night of the supermoon. It wasn't necessarily supernaturally related. Why would he pick me and stay with me from childhood? Is he connected to my dreams? Am I connected to him? These questions just go deeper and deeper down into the night, and it keeps me awake. I've recently moved 6 hours again, and I'm living with my parents as of 3 weeks ago. The same things have started up. I went to bed watching an anime on my phone, and it died mid-show, so I put the charger in. I woke up in the morning, and my phone was on my dresser across the room, perfectly aligned with the dresser edges, and I hear banging again, and hear my name being called. What does Jimmy and the paranormal world as a whole want with me? Why can't they just leave me alone and let me live a normal life? Is this going to end badly for me? Moving forward from this, here we are years later, and I've realized I don't need to embellish any of this. It's all real and all terrifying. Everything I've shared with you is the 100% truth. Who knows if Jimmy is still out there and really haunting me, or if it's something else entirely. When I was a small child, we lived with my grandparents for a short time. I slept in the back room, which had a light fixture. This is relevant. The one in the room was bigger and didn't have a little extra on top. In this room I saw my imaginary friends, which I called my sparkle friends. I called them that because they were literally glowing/sparkling orbs of light. I saw them before I went to sleep every night, and they lived inside the light fixture. I didn't have to verbally speak with my sparkle friends. We spoke telepathically, and over time my sparkle friends began to change shape. The one I remember the most, and was like the leader, was shaped like a carousel pony with intricate detail. One day I decided to tell my parents. They shrugged it off. All little kids have imaginary friends. That night, my sparkle friends told me that I wasn't supposed to tell my parents about them. I, of course, ended up telling my parents the next day that my sparkle friends didn't want me to tell anyone about them. And that night, my mum brought a glass of milk to the room and put it on the nightstand. The next morning, my brother came to wake me up and saw the milk had been poured all over my head, and I was all nasty and sticky. My parents asked me what happened, and I told them, I told you my sparkle friend said I wasn't supposed to tell you about them. I never saw my sparkle friends after that. My parents thought the whole thing was really weird and spoke to a psychologist friend about it. The psychologist said that because, as a small child, I was telling them the same story over and over without any changes in my story, the likelihood that I was making it up was slim. To this day it freaks me out. Those light fixtures creep me out too. When I was 5 or 6, my mum and I lived in a small apartment. When we had lived in the apartment, I had an imaginary friend called Jack. Whenever I was home, I was almost always playing or doing something with Jack. I don't remember too much about playing with him, but I remember a specific time when my mum and I were leaving to go somewhere, and I told my mum to wait a second so that Jack would come. She said Jack has to stay home and can't come. I have no idea where we were going, and I was pretty upset about it. Later my mum learned, and later she told me, that only a few years before we moved in there was a fire in the building. Only one person perished though, a 5-year-old named Jack. My mum also told me that when she would bring her boyfriend over occasionally, he would see a kid looking at him from the hallway, only to run off into my room. He asked my mum if I was awake, and they checked on me, and I was fast asleep. My parents claimed that when I was younger, I had an imaginary friend. I didn't think that this was anything special, since plenty of kids supposedly had them, but I couldn't remember anything about having one, so I thought they were joking when they mentioned to me in passing. They looked at me very seriously when I told them I had no clue what they were going on about. Then they said, "Are you sure you don't remember anything?" I really had no clue. So they told me about my imaginary friend, Jin. My parents are superstitious, being Filipino and all. It runs in our culture. So when I'd started talking to empty spaces and asking to set an extra plate of food at the table at around the age of 2 or 3, my parents felt something was up. I was the only child at the time, so they brushed it off as having an imaginary friend, as some sort of coping mechanism for being lonely. But they still had their worries. He followed me around from my home in the Philippines all the way to the UK where we live now, which eased them a bit, having been used to hearing stories about ghosts inhabiting homes. So they were sure it was just my active imagination. It wasn't until I started calling him a ghost and complaining about only having a ghost to speak to that they really got worried. It was this that spurred them into thinking about having more kids sooner than later, and around a year after, I was told I was going to be a big sister. They thought this would cause my friend to leave to no avail. If anything, things got weirder. My mother started experiencing strange things in our home. She used to hear running in the hallway. She'd have frequent nightmares. Photographs would fall off the walls at night, and only at night, and I started reporting weird things, like cutlery floating and my toys making sounds by themselves. One time, that really stood out to my mother, when she'd taken me with her for a handover in the hospital, to then pass me off to my dad who was finishing his shift. Supposedly, we'd been walking down a corridor when I'd stopped walking, and when I got to a set of stairs and pointed to the top, asking why there was a lady without a head. I was still very young at this point, so I was more curious than anything, but my mother was terrified. So she rushed to find my dad and ran us out the hospital as quickly as she could. After my sister was born, I spent less and less time with my imaginary friend. I was busy having started school at this age and a little sister to look after. I loved the responsibility and had fun pouring their formula and looking after them when my parents were cooking. So when my mother got pregnant again and my little brother was born, they had almost completely forgotten about my imaginary friend. Then I started to get ill. My attendance went down at primary school, and it got so bad that my parents were called in often to talk about the school and my illness. I was off for at least 3 to 4 weeks a year because of a recurring flu or infection. And then one day, a day I remember, my parents were downstairs cooking dinner, and I was upstairs looking after my siblings. One moment I'm playing Super Mario on my Game Boy, the next I hear multiple thuds all the way down the stairs before silence and a loud cry from downstairs. When I leave the room, I notice the baby gate at the stairs was open, and my sister was crying at the bottom. My parents rushed her to the hospital, and thankfully she only had a few bruises but was fine. They thought I forgot to close the gate, but when it happened again to my younger brother, they started to wonder if it really was my fault. It wasn't, by the way. After my sister's initial fall, I got so scared that I always made sure to check that gate. So when they asked me to look after them again, for a good while, I really did think it was my fault. But I remember checking those gates. I remember them being closed every time. So when my brother fell, I had no idea what to say to my parents except, sorry, which was probably a sign of guilt to them. Then one day out of the blue, I told them, Jin said he's gonna go home now. When they asked me where Jin was going to or if there was a reason why, I only shrugged my shoulders. They kept asking me more questions, but all I could say was he was going home, that he wasn't going to stay here anymore. Things quietened down after that, and supposedly stopped altogether when we moved houses. I had no idea everything before these falls had occurred. I don't remember having an imaginary friend. I don't remember speaking to him, and I don't remember the hospital or any of the cutlery moving. So much of this was news to me that I really thought my parents were making it up. But they will swear by each of these experiences. Even my grandparents had agreed when we were visiting the Philippines that even when I was young, this Jin was an invisible playmate that everyone knew of. Maybe I had a bad case of childhood amnesia, but it worries me. I supposedly did a lot of weird things without having any memory of it, but someone else seems to remember it like it were yesterday. Did anyone have an imaginary friend like this? I've asked all my friends, and no one even thought they were real until I told my story. Many who I told it to said I was just a creepy kid, and that he probably wasn't a normal imaginary friend, but I'm undecided. If not spooked about what younger me apparently got up to. Our house was fairly isolated. We had an attic that was never used, and the stairs to the attic were permanently ingrained into the closet. All that you had to do was open the closet door and go up the stairs. It was pretty convenient, to be honest. There wasn't a hatch, there was only the closet door. When I was a kid, I would have an imaginary friend. He would sometimes appear in the night, right before I'd go to sleep. We'd sometimes talk, and then he'd tell me to go to sleep. Sometimes he'd even lightly sing to me. It was quite nice. He was a tall, skinny-looking man. He had this gaunt face and these dark, dark eyes. I never found him to be scary, more just a company during the night. There'd be times where I'd call out to him and ask if he could sing me a song. He'd then come down the stairs, open the closet door, smile and sing me a song, before going back upstairs and vanishing into the dark of the attic. I just thought he was an imaginary friend. I never found him weird. One day, I'm talking with my parents and ask them if they know Billy. They ask me who I'm talking about, and I say, Billy, the imaginary friend of mine who lives in the attic. They give me a puzzled look and ask me what Jimmy looks like. I give him a description of Jimmy, and they just kind of brush it off, telling me that he's in my mind and not to think any more about it, but that they're glad that he comes and plays with me at night, singing me songs and such. I couldn't have been older than 4 at the time, so it's quite easy to understand my parents' instant dismissal of this. And this is where things get a little bit weird. A few weeks into having Jimmy be my imaginary friend, did my parents start asking if I was taking food. You see, we didn't have much money back then. We still don't. And when we'd wake up in the morning, sometimes food would be missing. Simple stuff like bread and cheese. There was one day in particular when my dad was preparing my lunchbox to take me to preschool. He opened up the fridge to pull the bread out, and in the little bag, there was only the butt, the end bit. He was sure the night before, after he made himself toast, that there was enough bread in here to make the sandwich. So she asked my mum if she had eaten this the night before. She said she hadn't, that they'd been together all night, which he concurred. So then he turned on me and asked me if I had eaten it. I said I hadn't. Things carried on getting weird. Leftover food would be nibbled at in the middle of the night, and my parents were starting to get seriously freaked out. Was this a hungry ghost? One night, As my imaginary friend was just about to go back up to the attic, I asked him, "Do you know who's eating all the food?" He said, "Sometimes I get hungry," and with a smile walked back up the stairs. I didn't think anything of it. But the next morning, I said to my parents that I knew that it was my imaginary friend who was taking the food. Again, they gave me a confused look, but this time took it a bit more seriously. My father called his office and called in sick. I didn't know this though. He took me to preschool as arranged, came back home and waited in silence just to see if anything would happen. Nothing did. So he called the police. He wondered if there was someone in the house, and although he felt a bit stupid, as more likely than not there wasn't, he knew it wasn't worth taking the risk. So he called the police, and knowing that my imaginary friend lived in the attic, took them to my bedroom, opened the door, and together they started making their way up into the attic. The police turned on the light, and what they found there horrified them. Living in our attic was a homeless man. He had stolen my father's clothes, he had been eating our food, and although he hadn't done anything to harm us, he'd been living there without our knowledge or consent, and definitely wasn't imaginary. He was promptly arrested, and we never saw or heard from him again. I completely forgot about this, and just assumed that Jimmy had gone, as imaginary friends sometimes do. It wasn't until many years later that my parents told me the truth, and I was horrified to know that my imaginary friend wasn't so imaginary after all. I had an imaginary friend, Michael. I supposedly fought with him, played with him, and made my parents set a plate for him at the table, and argued with people who couldn't see him. I don't really remember him or know when I stopped seeing him, but I was so adamant and supposedly things happened to freak family members out that they weren't sure he was imaginary. Being Catholic, I'm sure Michael brought up angelic thoughts in the family. My son, now 23, also had an imaginary friend named Gail. Where he came up with the name, I have no idea. Gail went through a progression. He lived in an apartment behind the chair in our living room. Then he got married, had a few kids, had a job. And I would ask my son what Gail was up to because I never saw him speak to him. Poor Gail, for being an imaginary friend, had the most boring life. I imagined he felt henpecked by his wife and his stressful job, and too many kids for that small apartment. I had my imaginary friend. I don't remember much about it, just what my family told me. She didn't have a name, and I just called her Friend. My family didn't think much of it, so they didn't ask. I basically did the typical play with her, talk and demand a place for her at the table thing. The strange thing that made them think something else could be going on was one night when my older sister and I were going to bed. We shared a bedroom, and he was asking me to turn the light off. I didn't want to, so I told her that she go, and we were back and forth until I say, "Friend, turn the light off," and the light went off. My sister, of course, ran to my parents' bedroom, scared shitless. I don't know if anything else like that happened again, because like I said, I don't have many memories about it, but it was creepy nonetheless. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed these fascinating, scary stories about imaginary friends. I certainly did. That one with the twist, where it was actually real all along, really got to me. I was like, damn. Imagine if you don't believe your kid and there's just someone living in your attic. That is creepy, guys. In any case, I hope you liked this. If of course you did, please be sure to let me know. And if there's a story you would like to share, you can do that by following the links on my Reddit page and in the description. Also, something to note is I'd like to thank all my incredible patrons for their support. If you would like to be a patron, feel free to sign up to Patreon. You can check the link in the description and you get some pretty funky perks for doing so. So, feel free. With that being said though, it's now time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.